Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
I have a question with regards to development. As we all do, I use two of the functions you mentioned. However, both are being used in an underdeveloped way. Is it likely that a driver function would still be underdeveloped at 30? And how would I be able to discern which truly is my driver or Copilot rather than inferior? More accurately, how would I know that the lack of development of what I think is my driver isn't actually my inferior if both are being used in an underdeveloped way? Brittany.
Thanks for the question, Brittany.
Yeah, so let me see if I can deconstruct this question a little bit, and especially for the sake of people who, anyone listening who might not be completely familiar with these different mental processes that each personality type has. So you mentioned that you use two mental processes, as everybody does. Each personality type has actually 4 of the 8 cognitive functions or mental processes that mostly or influence their personality the most. We use the car diagram because we think it's super easy to understand. Those 4 processes could be seen as what we call the driver, the Copilot, the 10-year-old, and the 3-year-old. So your driver and your Copilot are your strengths. They're your natural, the mental processes that your personality type has like a natural talent for. And what makes your driver distinct from your Copilot is that your driver process is it's a compulsion for you. All of us are compelled to use our driver process. It's our flow state. It feels really good. We are compelled to do this. And if we can't use our driver process, we can see it because we become rather depressed. We become highly depressed when we're not able to be in our flow state often enough, because our flow state is what rejuvenates us. It's what recharges our batteries. The Copilot process is a talent for us, but because it lives in a different attitude than our driver, and an attitude is just a fancy way of saying either introverted or extroverted. So if your driver process is, say, an extroverted process, then your Copilot is by definition introverted. And if your driver is an introverted process, then your Copilot is by definition an extroverted process. So since our Copilot is in the world that we are less comfortable with, right? Like, so for me, to give myself as an example, I'm an ENTP. My driver is extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. So my Copilot is introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. So I'm less comfortable in my introverted space because I prefer to be in the outer world. I'm an extrovert. And all of us have the same pattern hold true with our type. So our Copilot process is usually a little less developed, since we have to remind ourselves to go to that space and develop it. It's a talent, but it might not be something that we've exercised. Then the 10-year-old process is the opposite of the Copilot, and the 3-year-old is the opposite of the driver. And what you just said is, how do I know if something is my driver process or my 3-year-old, right? Because my driver might be so undeveloped that I can't tell the difference between, whether or not this is an undeveloped process or if this is my inferior or my 3-year-old process. So that's a little bit of a different question than whether or not my 3-year-old process is my, they get kind of confusing. It's like, I'm using 2 and I'm using my driver and Copilot, but how do I know that that's not my 3-year-old? So it can get really muddled really quick. And that's why I wanted to do just a brief little overview for anybody who's not familiar with functions.
Now, if you are totally lost of what Antonia is talking about, Brittany most likely has one of the personality development starter kits in front of her with a car model, which basically, for your personality type, breaks this down visually. There's a cheat sheet in there, and it will actually show you, based on your personality type, each of these mental processes and where they are in your car, what your driver, Copilot, 10-year-old, and 3-year-old are. So if you're able to take the test and get an idea of what you're leading with, the first and second positions, that driver and Copilot, from taking the test, you don't even have to get the starter kit, but just that'll give you a gauge to know what she's talking about for your personality.
Right. And if you aren't in a position to take the assessment or get the premium content, there's articles written on the blog post about the car model. Just type in car model or car diagram into the search engine, and you'll find a bunch of articles that kind of break down or describe and break down what these mental processes look like. So that said, the real question, I think, what I took away is, how can I tell if this process is my driver process or if it's my 3-year-old? The technical terms would be my dominant process or my inferior, because my dominant process might actually be undeveloped. Well, as I mentioned before, that dominant process, that drive, the reason why we call it a driver is because you can't stop using it. it is a compulsion for you. Now, there is a difference between use and development, right? Using and exercising are two different concepts. We like to use the illustration of somebody playing golf. If you've got a golf ball and a golf club and you're just kind of you're just swinging and hitting the golf club or golf ball over and over with the club, that's using the ball and the club. But if you put, a 3-inch diameter hole at the end of so many yards, right, down a green, and now your goal is to get the ball into that hole, well, now it's not just sort of arbitrarily batting the ball around with a club. Now you actually have something you're working towards. So you have to develop technique. You have to get better at it. You have to, refine what you're doing. You're not just, smacking a ball with a club. And so there definitely is a difference between use and exercising. And when we talk about a process being undeveloped, we're usually talking about the lack of exercise, not necessarily the lack of use. So you can tell what your dominant process is because you can't stop using it. It just feels so good to use. However, it can be undeveloped in the sense that you are using it, but you're not refining it. You're not exercising it. You're not encouraging it to grow and to become a more mature version of itself. Now, contrast that with the 3-year-old or the inferior process. That almost always feels icky to use, or at least if we have to use it in any, even the most mild sophistication or sophisticated way at all, if it's not just like a childlike version of it, then that's usually feels pretty bad to do so. I think, again, of my type as an ENTP. My 3-year-old or my inferior process is called introverted sensing, or we call it memory. And like when I'm just sitting around passively watching, say, crime shows, or I'm listening to a song that I've heard for the millionth time, or I'm doing something that feels just really like sort of warm and squishy in a nostalgic sort of way, that's all fine. I'm totally down with that. But the second that I have to engage in the introverted sensing world, right, and a more sophisticated version of that is that we keep our infrastructure going by creating procedures and processes and requiring, forms of ID to say get your license or whatever it is. As soon as I enter a world in which I am expected to perform in any way whatsoever using it, I just crumble. Like I'm practically sucking my thumb in the fetal position every time I have to get my license, or every time when I have to renew my passport, my head explodes, right? It's always a big deal for me. So that's really, for me, even if, let's say every single mental process inside of me was completely undeveloped and I was just not a very good version of myself, I could still parse out which one is my dominant process versus my inferior, because my dominant process of extroverted intuition or exploration can't stop exploring. It can't stop, right? Like if I'm in a context where I'm not surrounded by a lot of novelty, I will make novelty happen. I will do everything I can to experience novelty. I'll go find the most exotic foods I can find, or I'll just intentionally get lost in back roads, right? And try to get myself, try to figure out my way back. I can't stop doing it. It is a compulsion for me. So generally, if you feel like you're not in a super developed space and you're having questions around your dominant process or your driver process, ask yourself what activities are a compulsion for me? What are the things that I can't stop doing? And then reverse engineer it to match it to a cognitive function that is the most likely sort of etymology of those behaviors.
Thanks, Brittany, for the question. And if you've got a question for PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community, where Antonia and I can answer them live on the air, or at least recorded on the air, come over to personalityhacker.com and you can find out information on how to ask your question at our website. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk to you on the next PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community.